All right, now that we know how to make a great data table with Excel, let's use Excel to make our graphs. Very, very simple way. So again, we have our nice data right here. And typically in data, you have multiple trials where you then find an average, and you only want to use two of these values. You're only going to graph one variable versus another. So always in physics, we use what's called an XY scatter plot. So the first thing you have to do when completing a data graph is to decide what variables are you going to graph. So in this case, we want to graph average time versus distance. So we want the average time to be on x-axis and distance on the y. Always in physics, we want time on the x-axis. So what I need to do is dump the data that I want to graph somewhere else. So the first thing I want to do is highlight average time. I'm going to copy these numbers. And remember, these numbers were used as a formula, as you can see here at the top. We have a formula being used. So when I go to paste it, and I'm just going to dump it off to the side because I don't have to print this page. So if I'm using it as a file, I can open up a new sheet here and dump it in there, or I'll keep it over here and just dump it off to the side. When you paste it, you don't want to paste the function. You don't want to paste, just do a paste because it's looking to take the average of the three cells to the left of it. So I need to do a paste 1, 2, 3 and paste the values. And notice, don't worry about the decimals and so on. We made these 2 decimals to make it look nice, consistent with the rest of the data. But here we're just dumping it, and it's actually better to have the full data. We also then want to graph distance. So I'm going to highlight all that, do a copy, come over here, same thing. In this case, since I copied numbers, I can paste that, or I can just go back to copying the numbers, either one. I am going to add a 0 point to this, and that's something you'd want to go back and evaluate. Is 0, 0 a valid point? I don't really care about the look of this because, again, when I go to print, I'm just going to ignore that page, right? I'm going to pretend it's not there and not worry about printing that information out. So long as my data table is available for me to print and I don't need that extra data, won't show up. It'll show up on page 2. So you see the dotted line right here, that's showing where that's going to be dumped. And watch how easy this is. All I'm going to do, so again, your first column is the x-axis by default. Excel takes that as your x-axis. Highlight the data that I want, and remember your mouse must be this hollow cross. If I look at that, I'm going to cut and paste this somewhere. If I go to the dark cross, that's a copy. So what I want is the hollow cross, highlight both columns, all the data. And I go up here to insert, and here's all my charts that I can choose from right in the middle, all these charts. You have a pie graph, line, and so on and so on. So I'm going to choose this that is called, see the title, XY scatter. That's what we want. We want to do a scatter plot, which is going to be simply one variable next to another. So you have a choice of different scatter plots. This has the points. This has the line, a smooth curve. This plays more like connect the dots. You can see a slight difference between the two, not much. I'm going to choose that one, and there's my graph. Just like that, it plots all the points. This acts just like a picture in a publisher or something like that. So I can just pick it up and put it, center it right underneath my data table. And notice, though, what's very important, that's the plotting of my points, but I need to put some titles and things to this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to title my chart. In this case, I can say this is simply distance versus time, right? This is often called a position curve. So you don't need both of those on there, but that would be the title that would be correct for what we're doing right here. And notice when I click on the chart, so within the chart, you have this square, right? So that can be moved around. So be careful when you're clicking on what you want. I click this green plus and it allows me to add my axes titles. Okay. I can make that box a little bit bigger to have more room for my axes titles. This was time, average time. in units of seconds. So remember, you want titles and units. On the y-axis, this was distance in units of meters. So make sure you have your information. And I want that to be a little bit smaller there so that shows up a little bit better. You can move these around, make them look a little nicer if you want. So there's my graph. And make sure you're out of it. If I'm in it, when I go to do a print, it'll only look like I'm printing the graph. So there's my whole graph, right? So if we want the graph with the data table, make sure you're out of the graph in another cell so you don't have those highlighted squares on it. And if I go to print, there you go. Look at that. Nice and neat, very professional looking. So going back over here, might want it to be centered in a little bit different way so I can move it around. And there's my position graph. So another nice thing that you can do when we do more of a graphical analysis where it's important to look at the equation that goes with this, I would agree it looks more like a little bit of a connect the dots, that we don't get that smooth curve or the straight line that doesn't necessarily go through every point. In order to do that, you have to add a trend line. So I'm going to click on that. And when I add a trend line, I get to choose what kind of trend line does it look like. So I'm going to go over here to more options. I click the more options. And what I know about my trend line is I want it to be a linear. So you can see the dotted line that's showing up underneath. That's showing your linear trend line. It is not logarithmic, polynomial, and so on. So once we get more advanced, we can go into those functions. But another thing I can do, I could set the intercept, which we already did, made it 0, 0. Okay. I'm going to display my equation on the chart. And that automatically gives me my slope of the line because it's in the form of y equals mx plus b. So the slope of this line in the dotted line, so notice this point is slightly below, that point is slightly above. So it's a good trend line, what we call in there. It threw in that negative because this is showing that it might go through a little bit below, right? So we have a minus 0.06. So once I put in the trend line, I'm not showing up right at exactly 0, 0. So there does say that there is a y-intercept point there. But my slope of the line is 0.3664. On this graph, the significance of that slope is that would represent the speed of the object as it moves through these distances over time. That would represent the average speed. So the final thing I want to show, so notice this is not necessarily there. And notice that I could eliminate a point. So I'm going to highlight a point. Let's say something is off and I want to do some more of analysis. Here's this little eraser. It allows you to do different clearing. I'm going to clear the contents and notice it takes it right off the graph right there. So that took that number right off the graph. So that allows me to do a little bit of analysis. What happens if that number was slightly different? Because if we look at this data right up here, this number is actually probably the one I should have eliminated because that data point, I have a 9.4, which doesn't seem to fit the first two trials. That one's way off. But I'll go ahead and put that data back in, 8.42. And I can put it right back in and it doesn't change anything. And the point shows right back up. So you can't get rid of these numbers. This graph is constantly looking at that data to decide what it is graphing. So don't go back and erase that because it will erase your whole graph. And finally, on a good lab or something like that, we might want to write some kind of a conclusion here. So I just want to show you a neat trick, again, to put it all onto one point. Not sure what that's showing up there, is I can highlight maybe all of this underneath, right? And make that a whole space by just merging and centering it, typing, putting everything on the left, put it up in the upper left and start typing, right? So I can say I wanted to say something like the slope of the position versus time graph is 0.3664. This represents when I put that in, notice it puts it right there. I can change the font size if I want that to be bigger. So that would be kind of like your conclusion. I would want to wrap this text so it wraps it all around like it's in a paragraph of some sort, right? If I want a little bit more space, I'm going to make this row right here that I didn't use show up a little bit differently. I can change my colors. If I want to go up here and I want that to be a different color, make that stand out. You can do that for your lines and so on and so on. Okay, so there's so much you can do with that graph. For right now, just showing you the basics, how you take your data from your data table, dump it somewhere else so you only have the data that you want to graph. Remember, the first column is always your defaulted x-axis, and always go back and check that. My x-axis goes up to about 20, which is much higher, right, than the y-axis only needed to go up to 6. So I'm going to go back and double check that these points match what looks over here, because very many people make that mistake of putting the information in the wrong column, and they think they have it right, so they put the wrong titles on each axis. Like, let's say this was 6 and this one went up to 20. That would be my red flag to say, I don't think I plotted the right thing. All right, so just again, want to show you this as I print it, what that might look like. And there, whoops, I was in my graph. So if I get out of the graph, there you go. A very nice professional looking thing that I can turn in with my data table, my graph, and a little analysis or conclusion from the graph. Well, I hope this helps. Again, on the Google Sheets, I'm not as familiar with. The graphing, I know you can do the XY